In your experience, what percentage of your time do you spend talking versus listening when you're in a coaching session? For you personally, what have you found?
It will vary. And sometimes in like the first coaching session, I have found myself contextualizing what the coaching is about, and also giving a little bit of further background on like strength finders or APAS. So, and maybe like the first session, there's a little bit more talking on my part, but I would say that it really is probably, in the first session, it might be 50-50. In multiple sessions, it might be 20% me and 80% the client. So it's really about listening and hearing them, and sometimes reflecting back to them what they're saying, and then asking probing questions that they're navigating through it. But sometimes they will stumble a little bit and need a little bit of maybe some insight, and I sometimes will offer that. But it depends on the client themselves. And I've seen too that there have been folks that I have had a longer history with, that it becomes a little bit more of a dialogue and discussion too. So sometimes it's not strictly coaching, but there's sometimes that accompaniment, mentoring part that goes with it, a shared story. But for a new client, it's usually giving the context in the first session and beginning to ask some of those initial questions. And if they were even surprised with their results, but mostly it's about the listening.
So what does that giving context look like for you? Let's say a typical parishioner that you're coaching at St. Vincent's. What does this context piece look like in your first session?
Well, the context would be saying a little bit of what Strength Finders is. Often that may happen before they even take the assessment. So I like to be able to sit down with them before the assessment and give them that background in advance. What is Strength Finders? What is APAS? How is that? And talking a little bit about what unique design is, and even just focusing not on our weaknesses, but what are our talents that we in, and discovering really what God has dreamed us to be.
So you specifically mentioned going in prepared, and as a new coach, I feel that strongly. But one of the things you mentioned that I think would be helpful to what I'm saying here is the sort of preparing them by asking them to perhaps pray over their results. But I wonder what else you would recommend to us if we're facing someone who either really doesn't buy into the results they got, doesn't feel it's representative, and or that some of their strengths are really at odds with each other and they can't reconcile them. For a new coach, those are a little bit challenging.
Yes, it is. One of my first coachees had in Strength Finders had both individualization, and then they also had consistency. And so individualization means that you're going to make you're going to personalize something to a particular situation for that person. Maybe if you're teaching them or something like that. But then the consistency is like they're always the same rule kind of things. And so we explored, it really came down to asking the questions and saying that after we go through the first couple of really exploring each of the first couple of themes, to begin to see where they may be blending together. So sometimes we don't always see a particular talent, or we wrestle with a particular talent because it seems in odds with another one. But to understand that they really are leveraged together and they are used together. They're not, we will be initially in our coaching session analyzing them or exploring them independently and uniquely, but we're much more complex than that. And so the way in which they may work is more blended, or more leveraged than than looking at them independently of each other. So I kind of explain that we'll go through them individually, but then we'll begin to look at where they might be working together or how they may operate together. And some of that will be revealed in the stories and examples that the client may give from their own life of where they may have seen something at work. So even when I've even found where there are clients that have thought that something was really not them, when they've gone back and come back the next time, they're like, you know what, I thought about what you were saying or that question that you asked, and this is what I think of that. So I encourage them to be in dialogue with it, and we tend to be in dialogue together. So usually the first session or so is examining each of the talents independently. And I ask them to be patient. We're looking at them independently, but once we go through that, we can begin to look at through their stories that they tell, because they're sharing, they're doing most of the talking, to begin to see the links, the kernels that might be connected together, and that it isn't one size fits all. So even the descriptions themselves are limited. They are a starting point, but we can explore that a little bit more deeply. We're coming to understanding. Now, I have had, to answer the other half of that, I've had clients that have not liked what they saw. They said, this isn't me at all. This was like the old me and not the present me, and insisted on taking the assessment a second time. And they found that that they made all kinds of excuses the first time around, and then they took it again, and it came up with like the same top 5, or something may have been reordered a little bit, but they were still pretty accurate to the first assessment. So then they kind of sat back and wrestled with that. One of the things too in regard to that is that sometimes we do things so naturally, it comes so naturally to us that we have a blind spot to something that is a talent that we have. So, or a particular charism of the way in which we might minister to someone else through those different APES places. And so I kind of walk them through it, but there's a certain amount of, there's not an absolute answer for every person. It's really just listening to them. And sometimes it's setting it aside and saying, okay, let's go ahead and move on, because that it just isn't resonating with you in that way. And I might think of a different way of phrasing the description in order to help them too.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Thank you.
The folks that I have lined up for are actually spouses, and so obviously, or maybe not so obviously, I would assume we coach them individually. But is there any particular things, Sharon, you think you keep in mind if you're dealing with individuals who happen to be married?
Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up. I started out coaching people independently, and sometimes you need to do that. One time there was a couple that I ended up coaching them together, and we just through their top 5 of their strength finders, and we sat in their living room, and they kind of went through the descriptions, and I found that they were, where the one spouse would say they read through what they're like. So say it was achiever, they read through the description of achiever aloud with me and their spouse, and they would say whether something, when they had highlighted like the green or the red or the yellow, they said how it had resonated with them or didn't resonate with them, and their spouse would chime in and say, no, that's absolutely you. And it would give an example. And so I found that they would almost be like a coach of sorts, of being able to help their spouse be able to see something. And so I've done it depending on the nature of what their need is. I've done it independently with them. And in that case, it was circumstance that threw us together as a small group. And so we did it almost like a group coaching, where they took turns reading each of their descriptions. And I think we got through a couple of them that evening, but they were able to affirm one another, and then also have an aha moment of, oh, I see why you do that now. and that it's a strength that you have, and not a not something that you're just trying to do to drive me crazy. But and we had a date night with some of our parishioners too, and there were a couple of young couples that came to it, and for them it was very insightful. So they came to it, and we had them go back and forth and do that independently, and it really helped them to see their spouse in a new light, and it was a great discovery kind of tool in that. So I see a lot of potential of coaching married couples, and I think that also people who may be dating or are engaged, it might be a really good tool for those that would be open to it. But I find that I've done it independently of a couple, and I've done it with a couple together, and it's just applying the same principles to the group of the two of them, and it really turns out to be, it's not like a counseling session or anything like that. It's really becomes a moment of true affirmation of each other.
Yeah, a combination of affirmation and self-awareness. So you've actually done that, and you found it to be a positive dynamic.
Yes.
Okay, and I suppose, again, like anything, it would depend on the couple.
Exactly, and that's where you kind of have to feel it out a little bit, and it may be that you do it independently with each of them, and then offer it as something that they can do together and see if they are open to that. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the relationship, it determines whether or not they're really open to that too. And it might be one spouse over another too, but I've had some success having them coach together.
I have one last question, Sharon. Just
Okay.
in a minute or two, just give us kind of a big picture snapshot of what's happening at St. Vincent's. You folks have been at this now for a little over a year, and in 60 seconds, just give us kind of an overview of what you're seeing happen with your core leadership team.
Well, our core leadership team is now ready to begin to unveil this for the larger parish. We are, this past year has been a bit of an experiment for me, it was identifying different people who might be interested in the Strength Finders and APEST, and getting them and kind of selling them on the process and having them individually coached. And then we led a 6-session training with them too, so that they could really explore more in depth their talents, and also understand what, we spent most of our time on Strength Finders, but what does it mean to leverage talents on a team? What does it mean to do that in a family? So if you have a particular talent, so what's the dynamic that's going on there? What are examples of maturity of a talent, and maybe the immaturity of a talent? So how do you invest in your talents? And so we've had about 30 people that have gone through at least that much of the process, and some of them have come forward and been trained as coaches and have an interest on unveiling it for the rest of the community. And so now that we're into the new year, we are going to be coming together as a team to begin to plot that out a little bit and be strategic about how we might want to do that, and for me, to let go of some of it as the person that's been driving it, and empowering other people in our community to take more of a leadership role in that. So we're hoping that this spring to have a couple of planning sessions to dream a little bit how we might use these tools in varying degrees with our groups, with our families, with our our confirmation group and families and faith formation and that. So now I have a lot of people who are a little bit more self-aware themselves, but have also been trained with a little bit more depth in really what Strength Finders and APEST are, and are ready to be able to be coaches and to accompany their fellow parishioners on their journey.
The training that you did with the groups, did you do the training before the coaching or as a follow-up to the coaching?
That's a really good question. In most cases, it was as a follow-up to the coaching, or at least the introduction to strength finders and conversation with them. So some of those folks were people that had been sold on the process through pastoral counsel, through staff, but a lot of them had been previously coached. I've just recently tried to do it without the coaching happening first, and that really didn't work well. So I'm seeing that it's probably best to identify folks that you're inviting to be part of the process, and begin to get them coached. And once they have even just one coaching session underneath their belt, they are better equipped to participate in the more in-depth discovery. And in the training that we did, it included a lot of group coaching. So we had small tables where they were really, we gave them the mechanism to do that together and discover together, and then learn each, as we presented each new step or each new insight of the strength finders to them. We also help them put that to practice immediately. So it's hard to explain that precisely, but if you would want to have a longer conversation about that, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and that actually confirms. I know that when we were being coached, they recommended we don't even read the book before we do the coaching exercises, right? Or
Right.
Because you can't sort of bias yourself. So I kind of suspected you did the quote unquote training as a follow up, more of a discovery, unpacking kind of a thing. All right, thank you.
Exactly. And when we used the book, I was mostly asking them to go to the section which presented their five results, so that they could just read through that. I didn't prohibit them from reading anything else, but I certainly I narrowed down the focus of what I was asking of them. I think at this point that concludes our webinar. I hope you had a nice lunch and a good learning session, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. God bless you.